All right, ladies and gentlemen, so I'm sorry that this is the second ED puzzle video in a row that you're going to have to do, but I was unable to be in class today. However, when we last left, we talked about and finished with our video for homework about how the United States in World War I eventually declared war on the Central Powers because of the sinking of the Lusitania. Now, who was at fault could be debated a little bit, since the Lusitania was supposed to be a passenger ship, and yet the United States was transporting war supplies on that, and which violated the original agreement. But when we did come into the war, just note the date, it took until April 2nd of 1917, and as America began to enter the war, what's really interesting here is that Russia was actually just leaving. And Russia decided to leave World War I not on its own, not for its own benefit, but because it was actually going through their own civil war. The government in Russia at that time was an absolutist monarchy, meaning that the royal family had ruled Russia without question, that they had a divine right, essentially. And the final czar in that royal Russian line was Tsar Nicholas II. He had ruled for several years, unfortunately ruled over a very humiliating upset at the hands of the Japanese in the Russo-Japanese War in the early 1900s. And by 1917, after experiencing a few years of this horrible war that was really ravaging the country, which was taking a lot of the supplies from the commoners, a lot of the individuals in Russia who had been reading the Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx and really understanding that an absolutist monarchy was an outdated type of government, that it didn't seem to work anymore, especially in the modern era, as many countries had gotten rid of their monarchies by this point. They started to revolt, and Germany actually helped create this. What had happened in Russia was the Tsar Nicholas had actually been sending out and exiling leaders that he felt were a threat to the government. One of those leaders was Vladimir Lenin. You might recognize his name. When the Germans found out about Lenin, they actually decided to ship him back to Russia to see if he could cause any trouble for that country while they were still at war. And it probably was one of the smartest moves by the Germans in the entire war. And when they sent Lenin home in April of 1917, he rounded up his support group. They called themselves the Bolsheviks, which really means the majority. And they took control of Russia during that entire period. Excuse me for one. All right, folks, sorry for the delay there. So, as I was mentioning, the Germans helped Lenin get back to Russia, and when Lenin gets back, he is going to create a communist revolution here that is actually going to force Russia out of the war due to the fact that they are now no longer called Russia. In fact, when they become communist, they're going to become the Soviet Union. And this is going to be a country that lasts for about 70 years or so, until about 1991. And Russia's going to bow out of the war. The Soviet Union is going to bow out of the war. And it comes at an interesting time, because if we look at a map here of the World War I countries at the time, this is huge for Germany. This allows them to take all their troops that are here on the Eastern Front and take them over to the Western Front, which, if you remember from our notes, the Western Front was basically one long trench that moved very little, that didn't allow for a lot of lateral movement. And the Germans believed that with their Eastern troops, they could push this front and hopefully take Paris here with relative ease. Problem is that as soon as the Russians left the war, in come our country and in come the Americans to really kind of turn the tide. And it's not that the American Army, folks, was so much better equipped or that they had so much better tactics or anything, but it was really the influence and the influx of American industry that's going to make the big difference here. And it wasn't a popular decision. Not everybody in America wanted to join the war. In fact, Woodrow Wilson is going to have problems with Americans living out in the Midwest who felt pretty disconnected from a war that was 4,000 miles away or so. And he had to convince them, and he did it by doing these two things. He did it by building on the nationalist idea, building on the imperialistic notions we've been talking about in class, and he really declared very idealistic ideas. He said this is going to be the war to end all wars, and that we are going to be country that makes the world safe for democracy, that it's our responsibility as an emerging leader to protect democracy all around the world. And you're starting to see some of the seeds of the Cold War being planted here, that we feel like it's our responsibility to protect our government and our way of life. And we're going to initiate a draft. All men from 18 to 45 are going to be required to register, and our military is going to really boom here, over to 4 million soldiers. And they were quickly trained. They were thrown out into the Western Front. Unfortunately, our troops were not probably prepared for the realities of what trench warfare looked like, but the amount of supplies that they're going to bring with them, the amount of weaponry and ammunition is going to really refresh the British and the French who had been living in the trenches for years. And the war will come to a very quick close after the United States enters it. In fact, you can see here on the left-hand side, here's Kaiser Wilhelm II. He is going to have to abdicate the throne, and he's going to have to leave Germany and never return. And so when the war is over, really the key point for today is what the results of the war are. And when the war was over, you want to remember that at the beginning of the war, it was Russia, Britain, and France. Now it's Britain, France, and the United States. But the United States was very different than Britain and France. We had no bombs dropped on our homeland. We had no industry destroyed. We had very little men killed compared to the other countries. And so when it comes to the peace agreement, in a lot of ways, Britain and France are going to kind of look at the United States and really kind of tell them that they don't understand, that they don't really have a feeling of what it's like to live in Europe surrounded by these countries that were attacking them. And so our president, Woodrow Wilson, he's going to come to the Treaty of Versailles, you see here, and he's going to state his war aims and his goals for what's going on. And he's going to put all his ideas into one document called the 14 Points, all right? So 14 ideas that he wants to see come out of World War I, this awful tragedy that is World War I. Now, of those 14, the good news is you only need to know 4, but you do need to know them explicitly, okay? So here's the first one. The first one is self-determination. This was the idea that all peoples and all nations should have the right to independently rule themselves free of the colonial domination of an empire. Now, this one's kind of funny because we've just talked about all these countries that the United States tried to take over, like Hawaii and Cuba and the Philippines. And yet here's Woodrow Wilson saying that, no, nations should have the right to rule themselves if they want. And what he really meant was that the territories and the countries of Germany and Austria should have to give up their individual pieces and actually give up to new countries, but not the United States, that we are going to be a little bit different from that. Second idea is freedom of the seas. This idea that no matter if it's war or peace, that everybody should be able to sail their ship at any time and at any place. Now, this is obviously coming from the sinking of the Lusitania that had brought the United States into the war, but a very idealistic idea. I think it's hard to trust that a country in the time of war is going to respect an idea like this, and so we're going to not really see this come out in the actual treaty. We then see Woodrow Wilson also come up with an idea called the mandate system. Now, the mandate system was the process of taking former colonial powers and putting them under the control of the Allied powers. Now, you can't have the mandate system and self-determination, because self-determination is going to say that countries should be able to free themselves. So part of the mandate system is that eventually the Allied powers were going to give these countries their control back, but it wouldn't be for many years. And what that allows them to do is to influence these areas economically, even if they have to eventually let them go. So I put this company logo up here. Maybe you know what it is, maybe you don't. The BP stands for British Petroleum. It's one of the largest gas companies in the entire world, and it was created after World War I when the British took a lot of these territories in the Middle East from the Austrians and established their foothold in the Middle East so that they would have access to oil. And a lot of World War II battles happen in and around these Middle Eastern areas over control of these colonies. And then finally, the last piece in Woodrow Wilson's 14 points are the League of Nations. The League of Nations was supposed to be an international police force that worked to enforce peace, and this would incorporate all the major countries of the world and kind of work together to avoid another future war. Now, all these ideas, guys, please understand that all these ideas from Wilson are his ideas. They are not what the treaty actually said. Now, some of his ideas do get incorporated into the Treaty of Versailles, but this is just Woodrow Wilson bringing his ideas to Versailles. What actually happens at the peace meetings or the peace proceedings are very different. So here you see Wilson meeting with the other European leaders, and Wilson, when he sits down at the table with all the countries, including Germany and Austria, I just imagine them kind of looking around the table, and France and Britain really take the lead here, and they insist that at the end of the day, they want to be able to go back to their publics, their people, and tell them who was at fault. And they want to blame Germany for what is going on. And they want Germany to pay for it. You know, that Britain and France are destroyed. They've never seen any destruction like this. You know, to put this into perspective, guys, World War One, they lost 9 million lives. 9 million young men, mostly European. To compare that, you know, the Civil War was only in the hundreds of thousands. It's nothing compared to what we see in World War One. That's why we call the generation here the lost generation. They were an entire generation of men just wiped off the map, and it had never been happened before. And so Britain and France wanted Germany to pay for this. Now, these payments are called reparations. It's to repair. And the amount of the reparations was unbelievable. In today's terms, it would have been about $768 billion. It was just an unfathomable amount of money, but this is the responsibility they put on Germany. And so Germany kind of looks at this, and they have very little resistance because they can't. They've lost the war. And when it comes time to pay these reparations, you know, Germany is just going to print the money. They don't actually have it. They just print more money, which causes their currency to be worth less, which causes their economy to experience hyperinflation. And it's going to create just awful, extremely poor conditions in Germany. And by 1930, Germany is going to be one of the worst countries in terms of economic output in the entire world. We look at the United States during the Great Depression as a really awful time period in our country, and it was. The Great Depression, we experienced unemployment rates that hit 25%. 1 out of 4 Americans were out of work. But for Germany, that number doubled. They were in much worse condition than the United States, and yet, and when you're in a situation like that, when you're desperate, you look towards anybody to bring you out of it, even if that someone is giving a message of nationalism like Adolf Hitler. And Adolf Hitler, promised to get them out of it, and he was right. They just didn't imagine what his eventual vision was going to be for World War II. The second part of the Treaty of Versailles, guys, is going to be the redrawing of national boundaries. And the German and the Austrian and Ottoman empires are going to have to give up many of their territories that they had accomplished. And we're going to see the creation of new countries like Poland and Hungary, Yugoslavia, just to name a few. And these were designed to liberate a lot of the nationalities that were there. And then finally, the treaty did create the League of Nations. And the League of Nations is different than the United Nations. If that gives you any indication of how successful the League of Nations actually was. But the League of Nations was created and organized by the nations of Europe. Now, when the treaty was finished, Woodrow Wilson then comes back with the formal document to the United States and asks them, do we want to incorporate this into our country? Because treaties can only be ratified by our Congress. And when he brought it back and he said, hey guys, here we go. We're going to redraw the boundaries, and the United States goes, okay, yeah, good. We are going to make Germany pay for what they did. And they said, okay, that's fine. It doesn't really involve us. And he said, and we're going to create the League of Nations, and we're going to have everybody involved in this, and it's going to be a peacekeeping organization so that if a European country attacks another one, we can come and help. And Congress looks at this and goes, wait a minute. You're saying that if Europe gets into another war, we're going to be obligated to come in? And our Senate didn't really like the idea of that. They didn't want to be caught up in a potential conflict that Europeans could create that had nothing to do with Americans. And when it came down to vote for the treaty, we never signed it. We never actually agreed to the Treaty of Versailles, and therefore we never joined the League of Nations. And so the League of Nations was an American idea created by an American president that didn't include America. And so this is ultimately going to lead to the failure of the